Hey, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Leadership Podcast, where our disagreements inform your decisions. I am Will Atkins, coming at you from the left. I'm with my co-hosts here, Thea Ali, also from the left, Brett Miller, coming from the right, and then our token libertarian, Dion Dixon, generally coming at you from the right as well. Before we get going, if you've been enjoying these discussions we've been having, please like and subscribe and share us with your friends and family. You know, we really enjoy putting these things on and kind of getting to the heart of some of the more complex and challenging topics of the day. And for this week, since Donald Trump's big, beautiful budget has been in the news a little bit lately, we're going to be talking about the debt and deficit spending during this week's podcast. And I'm sure that, you know, just to get us kicked off, I'm sure that at some point, you know, we will end up having, you know, at least some level of an abstract conversation about just debt and deficit spending in general. And that's fine. There are pros and cons to all of that. As I was prepping for this particular week, one of the things that really stood out to me is, you know, historically and stereotypically, you know, Democrats are known as the tax and spend Democrats, right? But I remember, you know, I seem to remember a time when Republicans were actually fiscally conservative, and I don't see a whole lot of that anymore. You know,
well,
so
when you say you remember it, are you implying that happened during your lifetime? Because I'm pretty sure that while Reagan, Bush Sr., George W. Bush, and Trump all talked the talk, I don't think any of them,
not a single one of them did.
Yeah.
Right. And that's the point. I mean, there's a lot of things in our political discourse that, you know, people fall back on these stereotypes, or, you know, well, I've always heard that Democrats are tax and spend liberals and, you know, Republicans are fiscally conservative. But when you actually look into it, that's not actually true at all, you know? So yeah, just to get us kicked off a little bit. So for what's going on right now with Trump's big, beautiful bill, big, beautiful budget, there are things in there like no tax on tips, no tax on overtime, you know, things like that. But then the bulk of it is an extension of Trump's tax cuts for the wealthy. And all of those tax cuts lowers our revenue by about $3.7 trillion. But then there are also programmatic cuts where he doesn't want to spend as much, and he's got something like $1.3 trillion worth of programmatic cuts. This is a thing that Democrats are going to be up in arms about you know, Medicare and SNAP and things like that, right? But that 1.3 trillion in lowered expenditures does not overcome the fact that there's 3.7 trillion less money coming in. So what you end up with is Trump's big, beautiful bill will add about $2.4 trillion to the debt. And when we look back over time, you know, Dion, you were just kind of touching on it. Reagan, both Bushes, Trump have all added to deficits, have all gone up under those presidents, whereas Clinton and Obama were the only presidents in the modern age where deficits were actually reduced, which flies in the face kind of our kind of stereotypical, you know.
I have a point of clarification there.
Go for it.
So Clinton, absolutely true. He actually brought in a surplus one year, which fantastic for him. Obama first raised it to a record over $1 trillion deficit and then brought it down the next year. So I'm not sure that counts. That's a bit like the Simpsons episode where they're trying to save money and Bart is like, I'm going to take up smoking and then quit. Like,
Well, I
So
guess I think
go
Well,
ahead.
I think the thing though, listening to what Will's saying though, is well, what the Obama when you say he raised it, it's also that was in the middle of the financial crisis, right? And so that was the bailout that caused that high spending. And the thing that I noticed when I was looking at this, kind of doing the research for this week, it's not just that Republican administrations, have added to the deficit. It's not that they've added to the deficit through spending per se. It's that they have added to the deficit through tax cuts. Like the Bush tax cuts is what added to the deficit. And now we see, the Trump tax cuts have been what has added to the deficit even more. And my whole thing is if the concern is that running these deficits is so harmful to our country, I've never understood why not cut spending and maintain those tax levels long enough to actually make an impact in the deficit so that we're not passing on this debt to future generations. Like to me, and then once you've paid off the deficit, then you can cut taxes. Like to me, that's just what would logically make sense.
so
And that's where
I
I've
think
always had it not understood.
before we go too much further, I think for our listeners and to make sure that we're all on the same page, we'll be throwing around words like debt and deficit, revenue. So I think it's important that when we talk about this issue in terms of our country's finances, typically the debt is what is referred to as the accumulating amount of money that we owe year after year after year, which right now sits at close to $37 trillion. The deficit is usually what we call each year there is a budget and we bring in revenue mostly through taxes and some other forms, and then we spend that money through government activity and programs. And whatever the difference in that, if spending is greater than how much we brought in revenue that year, that is generally referred to as a deficit. So deficits are year to year, and then the debt is the accumulation of all of that deficit and then the interest along with it. So just to make sure that we're all clear and our listeners are clear on the terminology that we're using as we go forward.
And I guess just a foot stomp on that, when you increase the deficit, then you're increasing the amount that we have to borrow each year, which then, like you said, increases our overall debt that we're carrying year to year as a country.
Right. So Trump's big beautiful budget is estimated to have $2.4 trillion of deficit, which would add that amount to the debt, which is close to 37 trillion. So we're looking at an additional like 8% onto our total debt, of which 25% of our total debt is from Trump's first administration. Right? Say yes.
I mean, I think the point Will's making, I think it's a valid one as far as coming into the conversation, in that just dispelling the myth that one party is more fiscally responsible when it comes to the overall debt and then deficits each year. Now I think it's a more nuanced conversation than that. Like I'm not going to say that the Democrats are I'm not going to try to do it the other way and make it seem like the Democrats are the party that has the better, some kind of mastery on spending and has really put any real effort into paying down our national debt. But I do think what I find disingenuous as someone on the left, whenever I hear these conversations, is there's always this idea that the Democrats are the party that spends, and therefore any debt that we're carrying is due to these big programs that Democrats are always pushing, and we're spending on these pork belly projects, and if it weren't for our times when Democrats were in charge, there would be no debt. And then even more so when there are times where money needs to be spent, that's, then all of a sudden the same Republicans who were very quick to pass a big, beautiful bill that adds to a deficit, when the situation's reversed, the first thing they'll say is, oh, no, we can't pass any new legislation because it's going to add to a deficit, which will add to our debt. And it's like, well, but when you're in charge, you don't have a problem doing that as long. And I think the last thing I'll say for the point of our conversation is what we've seen with the big beautiful bill is, well, who is it that's benefiting, or who is it that's directly going to see the benefits of some of the things in that bill? And right now it doesn't feel like it's the same everyday Americans that, supposedly, voted for Trump for economic reasons.
Now, to be fair, during the Biden administration, there were a lot of, multi-billion-dollar programs that were going out to EVs, solar companies. There were, I'm trying to think the student loan forgiveness was a multi-billion-dollar effort. That one failed so far, but so when you look at it, as you guys have kind of pointed out, Republican or Democrat, there are billions of dollars flowing out to certain groups of people, and it's not usually the poor or the lower middle class. It's somebody who is in a upper middle class or upper class, and like whether it be college students or the oligarchy or whatever it is. I would like to say that, given the chance, the Libertarians probably would cut a hell of a lot of government spending right away. And again, I'll hold up my boy Javier Milei down in Argentina. That guy has done some tremendous work down there. Not saying it would be a one-to-one analog here in the United States, but give us the chance. We will cut spending.
By the way, I feel like this is the pet episode because I just saw Will's cat come in the camera, and I can see my dog, one of my dogs, in the background. So this is the pets care about spending and deficits. So yeah.
Or we just need to have our support animals near us when we talk.
We need to have our support animals while we have this discussion.
If you guys don't mind, there are two websites that I wanted to show to our viewers, and of course for our listeners, I will have to describe them. But I'd like to share my screen and show a couple of these things because they are just they're awe-inspiring to me, just in their sheer craziness. So the first one is the U.S. debt clock. So I'm going to share my screen here. There we go. Okay, share. All right, so hopefully you guys can see this, and it is just ticking away, and we can see up here in the upper left corner, $36.9-ish trillion in U.S. national debt, and it just keeps ticking up, and that's because not only do we have interest on the debt, which keeps adding to that, but we keep spending money, right? And then you can see just below it and off to the right, we have the U.S. federal budget deficit, which, as we said, that's the amount this year that we are spending more than we are bringing in revenue. And off to the right of it, you can see the revenue ticking up. So, that's what we are estimating to bring in based on like taxes and things. But of course, we don't know until all the taxes are filed. The other thing that I want to show is this other website here. It's demonocracy.info, and it's a graphic on like visualizing the national debt. And I'll try to go through this quickly. It starts with one $100 bill. And then it shows a stack. It says this is what 10,000 looks like. Here's a bunch of them. It shows $1 million.
We're still seeing the debt clock.
Oh, you are? Okay. Sorry.
Let
me. Okay. I guess I have to stop sharing that one and then share again this one. Okay. Can you see it now?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay. So starts with $100. Then you see 10,000, which is a nice fancy stack there. $1 million is kind of a big pile. $100 million makes this nice little couch that this woman can sit on, or it's like a big pallet of these $100 bills. And remember, these are $100 bills, not $1 bills. And then we go down and make some comparison. And this is a few years old because this is from 2022, but it kind of talks about like that's the amount that like the average American, 3,500 average Americans make in a year. So $1 billion, you have a bunch of these pallets. Again, $100 bills. When we get to $1 trillion, this is where it starts to really just become mind blowing. $1 trillion is like 3 football fields full of these pallets. And then we get down to the most mind-blowing graphic that I think I've seen in a long, long time, which is this is 2022, where the debt was $30 trillion. And this is just like pallets and pallets and pallets stacked around the Statue of Liberty and just completely dwarfing the Statue of Liberty. And that is just, it is just an obscene amount of money. So, like, I just wanted to share those with our viewers and with our listeners. Please go to the websites. I'll put the links in the show notes so that you can go to those websites and take a look. But it is just completely mind blowing to visualize that.
I guess the thing I guess is worth saying: are we emphasizing this just to emphasize that the debt is large? Is that the point that's what we're looking at?
So it would seem to me, I mean, Dion, as the libertarian, you want such reductions in government programs and government spending that it would naturally take care of the debt itself, right?
Yeah, I think the responsible thing, and I'm sure different libertarians would argue about the way to do this. I think the responsible thing is that you would have to reduce government spending and keep taxation at or near where it is right now, so that you generate a budget surplus for many years in a row, so that you can not just pay the minimum amount to service the debt, but actually pay the debt down. And then once the debt is paid down, then you can reduce taxation, because, of course, all libertarians believe that taxation is theft.
Now, do you think, because that does surprise me just a little bit, do you think that is in line with most libertarians, or do you think that they would argue get rid of the taxation first?
So I think if I could put myself in the shoes of most libertarians, I would say most of them would probably say that you drastically reduce the size of government, thereby drastically reducing spending, and then you drastically reduce taxation, but not to the point where you're still running a deficit. And you just take both of those levels all the way down to the ground floor as much as you can, and then continue to pay off the debt from there. Some libertarians would say, screw it, let's just default on our debt and stop taxation and cut the government, and let's start over with a clean sheet of paper. But I think most of us know that in this world economy, that just would not fly. We would find the United States just in such a world of hurt economically if we defaulted on our debt.
I mean, the whole world would be in an economic world of hurt, I would think.
Yeah.
So, Brett, from the right then, and I'm sensitive to the fact that I've thrown some grenades towards the right already tonight. Your thoughts on the debt and deficit spending, and then and Trump's big beautiful bill.
So are you asking for my personal thoughts or thoughts from the far right?
Both. I mean, give us not necessarily the far right, because I don't really care what those people think, but in general, like, the Republican platform type stance, but then just you personally.
Well, I think it goes to be what's already been said, is that there is a lot of lip service to running fiscally responsible, and then it doesn't play out that way. And that happens on all sides. It's almost like we have politicians that don't actually care about us. It's amazing. It's just that whole concept that they kind of forget their constituents and they're just running for whatever they want to do, because they just say what they want so they can get reelected. And unfortunately, the American populace is dumb enough to keep reelecting them. But, well, that's probably a bit harsh from that standpoint. But I think people are just unaware, right? They don't really care so much to where they're not really paying attention to these things, but I think they should. I think they should have a care about it, because to Thea's point, we're passing on this debt to future generations. And it's the fact that they have no say in the matter, and yet they're going to be shackled with the responsibility that comes with it. And so I think we drastically need to change the way that we operate. Now, like I said, the probably more far right standpoint of things is generally, yes, we want to cut spending, but we only want to cut spending in certain areas. Historically, the right has always been a supporter of the military and military spending, which wars are profitable, right? And sadly, that kind of leads more into the warmongering and a lot of the issues that we have faced coming from that. So coming back to my personal standpoint, I don't agree with that. I think we are way out of sorts with how we've been handling the budget. We have been for probably 100+ years. I mean, we saw a great spike. Really, in the Great Depression is where it started. The New Deal, everything was around then. And then we saw a significant spike coming out of World War II. But then we had a nice leveling effect for about 20 to 25 years where we weren't really increasing. We were very responsible with things and we did okay. And then the government decided to go off of the gold standard, right? And so now we've got fiat money and we can just print and print and print and print with no backing whatsoever. And it's amazing because when you're on the gold standard, you actually have to get approval from the populace to continue spending money. But if you're not on that and you can just print when you want, guess what? You don't have to ask the taxpayers if we can spend more money. And it just continues to make it worse. And that's where we've seen this astronomical spike. And just you see the graph and it just continues to grow and grow and grow up to the right. And so we've spent, as Dion's picture showed, just an exorbitant amount of money that the taxpayers are now carrying that debt. We say it's the government, but the government is supposed to be made of the people. So that kind of all falls on America from that standpoint. So yeah, I agree that we need to change things very much so. And to Dion's point, I think cutting government spending and the big areas that nobody ever wants to talk about, right? Political suicide, Social Security, Medicare, government spending, or not government, but military spending, those are our three biggest, although I think the servicing on our debt has now surpassed our military budget. So, right. That's one of like just looking at that
until the big, beautiful bill passes and then
the military goes up to $1 trillion.
Yeah. And again, that's the stuff that I don't agree with. Now we're all military backgrounds, right? We have that experience. And so I think we know the value of having, the strength through power, right? That's the wrong phrasing. Peace through strength, right? And to have peace through strength, yeah, you need to actually be strong. So I get that, but having worked in the acquisition field of the military, when I did that, there's a lot of money that gets spent that shouldn't be spent, right? And I know that's just in one area of one piece of the government, let alone the whole big thing that's there. So we need to drastically cut the government spending. And I think for a time, this is where coming back to the values of responsibility, last week we talked about American values and where that's in. And I think we've got to the point where we're enjoying our liberties too much that we're forgetting our responsibilities. And as American citizens, it's not just about us individually. It's about preparing for that future generation. So taking on that responsibility of, yes, I may have to pay taxes for a time in order to ensure that future generations have a better scenario to be in. And so, cut the government spending, keep the taxes where they are for the time being. But then as that government spending goes down and we start attacking the debt, that's when you can start lowering the taxes and giving back to the people. And it's not just like a all for one kind of aspect. There's ways that you can work through that and still give back to the people during that time. Ultimately, that's just, I don't know. I guess it's the basis for where I feel.
So let me ask you this then. This is kind of for everyone. So Thea had mentioned earlier, and this is, again, it'll sound like a jab towards the right again, but there has been what seems to be a recurring trend of some kind of economic recession catastrophe going on during Republican administrations, and then Democrats coming in and having to spend to get out of that situation. And we can argue about the merits of that, whether or not that's true or not, that sort of thing. But how do we feel about deficit spending to recover from certain economic things? Like, and you could say COVID, right? Like that wasn't necessarily Trump's fault, right?
I would use the bailout instead of COVID. The
The
bailout from
2008?
the financial. I would use that instead of
but
COVID because I don't want
in
us to go down
general,
a COVID argument.
But in general, are we okay with deficit spending to pull ourselves out of situations like either one of those, or like, are we okay with deficit spending in certain situations, or what?
I mean, I think you would handle it like a personal budget. To me, like the big spending, it's just more money on the table, but it's the same principles that apply to it, is that you have to live below your means, right? You have to live in a way that you have a surplus available so that when stuff like that happens, you're not dipping into deficit. You're actually pulling from savings, so to speak, to pay for that. Now, above and beyond that, yeah, there are times where proper investment and proper debt strategy actually makes sense. To consumer debt for the average person, right? I mean, coming from a business owner standpoint, that consumer debt for the most part is a bad way to go, right? You never want to be financing a Big Mac, right? But a lot of people do that. On the other hand, though, if you take on proper business debt and you know how to leverage it to build an asset or to grow an asset to where your debt is actually earning money for you, that's different. Right. And so not all debt is bad, but when you are in a constant state of deficit spending and you never balance a budget and you never plan to balance a budget and you just have the ability to keep printing yourself more money, that's not the way to go. And so when we start looking at this deficit spending, that's where we have the issue, is that there is no trajectory. There's no evidence that has shown that the government, either side, right? Well, trust me, I understand the right is not perfect in this, but the left's far from it too. Like the government in general, they don't have the intention to actually put our country back on a financial track to make it better. And so, I don't.
I mean, I hear what you're saying, but I think that it comes back to the rub that I have is a lot of, at least like, this idea that when there are times where the spending is in the crisis, you're dealing with a crisis and the spending is being driven by a specific crisis versus the spending is being driven by a desire to give back to the people who funded your campaign. And that's where I feel like a lot of the tax cuts, it's in particular the Trump tax cuts and things that we're seeing in this big, beautiful bill, seem to be directly tied to the people who spend a lot of money to get Trump elected. And maybe that's a cynical view on my part, but I do think there's a difference between running a deficit in response to COVID or the financial crisis versus running a deficit to give tax cuts to certain individuals or to certain companies or people who fall into certain classes. And that's where it's like, it just doesn't, not only does it feel disingenuous, but it just feels like, it makes me feel very cynical about the Republican Party as far as what they really value.
And I don't disagree with you on that, Thea. I don't. It's, again, cutting taxes without cutting spending is, again, the wrong way to go. Yeah. I know it makes like the individual person feel good because their taxes are better. But again, if we're not taking that role of responsibility of we have to think about the bigger picture, that's not a great spot to be in. It's the Leviathan crisis. It's that whole concept that it plays into, that every time there is a crisis that pops up, the government always steps in and says, hey, guess what? Big Brother's here to help. Let us take care of that. And what happens is they step in and they take power and they say, we only need this for a little bit to solve this problem. But the issue is they never give it back afterwards. And so we constantly see this growing issue. And that's where we've gotten to. And so, yeah, even when a crisis pops up like the 2008 recession or COVID, or pick your crisis, right? It doesn't matter. There has been this ballooning of the government that never recedes. And that's where it needs to come in. And that stuff needs to be cut and trimmed out. And I don't know, Six Sigma, right? Like lean this thing out.
Now would be one of the times where what you're describing seems like this would be the time to do that. And in theory, Doge could have done that, right? In theory, what we could have seen was Doge doing some type of methodical, looking at government spending and cutting spending. And I think they were doing a version of that. We already discussed our problems. I think I voiced my problems in the Doge episode of like how ineffective the way they went about it was. But in theory, they could have done that. And then the big, beautiful bill could have followed up with, trying to show like, actually balance a budget for the first time in 25, 30, almost 30 years. Right. And I don't understand like how those two things are so disconnected right now. Like we spent the first couple of months of this administration talking about cutting spending. And then it's like the first big piece of legislation balloons spending. And I'm like, well, how did we get here? I just,
yeah. Well, I mean, that's part of the reason why we have this giant ego waving contest going on social media right now, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm not. I've spoken about my opinions of Elon Musk, but for once, like I guess I got to give him credit for at least being consistent in his whole issue when it comes to government spending, and his I think his objections to the bill are consistent with that, with the issues that he's spoken of government spending. Whereas the rest of the people who are pushing for the bill, there's an inconsistency between the legislation that they're voting for versus the stance that many of them, I won't say every Republican politician, because I know there's a few, and we still really haven't had the Senate weigh in on this bill, but you saw a lot of House members who have made a career of talking about spending and deficits and debt vote in favor of the bill, and then some of them say later, well, I didn't know what was in the bill because I didn't have the opportunity to read it. So
yeah. Dion,
so
I'm going to bring you in now. Yeah, I want to bring you in, but also when you're discussing your point, can you also talk? So the clock that you brought up had a 500 billion for Doge, and I was caught off guard by that because like low 100s is what I had seen for Doge, and I wanted to make sure I was actually reading that correctly, that was what it was trying to say.
You did.
Okay. Got it.
Yeah. And I'm skeptical about that number as well, because of what we've seen. Honestly, I don't know where that number came from. And pretty much as soon as Elon and Doge got started, they added that block to the debt clock. And I honestly am not sure like how they started tracking those numbers. So I can't speak to that.
Okay.
So what I wanted to mention, and I guess this goes back to your earlier comment, Will, about me maybe leaning right, but I will enter in a little bit of not defense, but explanation that I heard from a Republican Virginia state delegate here in Virginia. His name is Nick Freitas, and he's quite a popular social media figure now. But he was talking about this rescission bill, which is what the big, beautiful bill is. And he was talking about, he also, by the way, he disagreed with the bill. He thought that he kind of had the same reaction to it as Elon Musk did, which is, hey, I thought we were cutting government spending. What the heck is going on? Why are we increasing it? But he said, however, there is a political process that we have to be cognizant of when we want to do things. And he said the rescission bill is not subject to the filibuster in the Senate, but a full out appropriations bill is. And when you have only one or two seats at best majority in the Senate, you have to be aware of what you put in the bill, and you have to be aware of what things that could be added to the bill that would trigger it to be subject to the filibuster, which then means that it probably will fail. And so he was like, this is not a defense of what's in the bill or what didn't make it into the bill necessarily, but it is an explanation of maybe how we got here. And so we do have to be aware that there are certain rules, at least in the Senate, that could essentially affect whether the bill even just like makes it to a vote. right? And that has to be considered as they go forward. And again, I'm with Elon Musk. I think this bill was just like okay, fine, you want to put your tax cuts in, well, you better find the government cuts to spending to offset those tax cuts, right? You at the very least, you should have brought in a balanced budget, right? That's the very least you
Yeah.
should have done, however you got there.
Now, do you think that Elon is really upset because it's not balanced, or because the amount of funding that he wanted for his projects are not in there?
I I I actually don't think that's the issue. I don't, because in the campaign, at least with like the EV subsidies and stuff like that, Trump campaigned on that, and Musk would have been aware of those positions. It's not like it's a new position. I actually think it's more that that Musk put a lot of time into the Doge cuts, and this basically makes them null and void. Whatever progress, whether it not be, however much progress was done, is essentially erased by this bill. And I think there's a feeling of like, look at what I just gave up all this. My companies took a hit. I dedicated my time to this. I thought we were on the same page, friend. And now look what's going on.
And the reason I struggle with that, though, is even in a best case scenario, Elon was saying he could find $1 trillion. All right. He found low 100 billions, right? If Trump's adding 2.4 trillion to it, like it's not just the big beautiful bill is wiping out what Elon did. Like it's not even close, right?
Well, I think it's the like, you can't even pretend like the intent, like we are on the same page, right? It's the blatancy of how this bill completely shows that cutting government spending is just not really a priority. And I think it's like and again, I hate to use Elon Musk and his reaction to the bill, as like the thing we're focusing on, but I think it highlights like somebody who may have genuinely believed what, in what Doge was doing, and thought, and had genuinely thought that the administration was on the same page, and then has been disillusioned to find out, nope, just kidding. That was that, like he, basically Doge was your project that you were allowed to do because you put a lot of money into the campaign, and now the real agenda is coming forward for all the other people who put money into this. And I think we just got a front row seat of it, but it does highlight the hypocrisy, and I think that's interesting.
So we keep bringing up the $2.4 trillion deficit in the big, beautiful bill. And I think there also needs to be a little bit of explanation there for our listeners and viewers, in that is not a like solid black and white figure, because it depends on projecting out how much revenue is going to come in through taxes. And so what Republicans will do, I think they're far more guilty of this than the Democrats, is they will say, well, look, if I enact these tax cuts for the richest people, I'm using air quotes, those are the business owners, those are the people who make investments, and so those people will now have more money to hire more people. Right now, I think we have like 7 million ish Americans who could be working, who are out of work right now. And so the rosy glasses that they put on is these 7 million Americans who are out of work will all of a sudden be in the workforce. They will now be earning a paycheck, which is great for them, but we'll also be getting tax revenue off of them, which will, help fill the government coffers. So it's really not that bad. And it's not really 2.4 trillion is what the Republicans will say. And of course, there are some who say it's actually far more than 2.4 trillion, because you're not taking into account all these other aspects that happen. Like what if Mr. Moneybags doesn't use that to hire more people, and he just, shoves it into his own personal investments or sends it offshore, whatever it is. What if he chooses to invest that money into AI and automation, which hires nobody, right? So, but the 2.4 it's kind of a figure that I think like kind of the bell curve, where sort of in the middle, that's where a lot of economists can kind of agree that's probably about where the deficit will truly end up. But I think it's important for everybody to know that it's not like this is a solid calculable figure that just sits there and looks at you in the face. You have to make some assumptions, and then based on those assumptions, you could trick yourself into thinking that the deficit is either better or worse than it really is, just based on how you want to approach it.
And for our listeners, what Dion's describing, the Republican counterargument that, by giving the tax cuts to the businesses and they'll reinvest, for our listeners, that would be called trickle down economics, which has never worked. Which, they have been using that argument for the last 50 some odd years, and it has never turned out that way.
Well, and the data supports that instead of trickle down economics, which you've seen is that's where you see the gap in the wealth gap has grown, right? Where the rich just get richer, and then you see the dilution of the middle class. And so instead of it trickling down and creating more jobs, that's where you get the stock buybacks, and you see the wealth just accumulating amongst the top echelon in the economy. So I agree with that but I agree with Deanna. What I was going to say is that economics, and this is the thing about like the study of economics, it's based on the assumptions that you're making, right? Whenever you're trying to build these models, you make your own assumptions, and then you build your economic model off of it. And it's like, unfortunately, people will always find the right assumption to make to support their position, and yet the debt continues to accumulate over time. And so I think that's where I think we all agree the debt is bad. I think we all agree that continuing to every year not even aim towards balancing a budget, is irresponsible on the part of our lawmakers. I'm old enough to remember, and I think all of us would be, and I didn't understand the significance of it, but I'm old enough in the 90s to remember how big of a deal in the Clinton administration when they were able to balance the budget. I remember that,
Mm-hmm.
and I think it's interesting because you can't say that Gingrich and Clinton were buddies, you know what I mean? And
Right.
that, that was a situation where you had divided government. And yet somehow, but I think because it was a priority to make that statement to the American people that the budget could be balanced, then it did. And I don't understand why we've gotten so far away from that in less than a generation.
And just I'm gonna, because I've been throwing grenades at the right, all night. I am gonna say a little bit. I mean, it was a priority of theirs, and Gore did do the reinventing government thing where he tried to skinny the government down. But a lot of the surplus under the Clinton years was also because we had a .com boom that, like, everything took off. Like I don't think that they would have been as successful had we not had the .com boom. And I don't think that they were necessarily planning on, hey guys, we know there's a .com boom coming. So, if
don't forget the BRAC too. The BRAC, I mean, we had a huge military drawdown.
Yeah.
Most of our
In the
viewers
90s.
and listeners probably are, I'm going to guess, are younger than us and probably don't remember that, like, Cold War military spending was a huge part. Like, people think that we have a huge military budget now, but it is like half, maybe, if that, of what we were spending in the 50s and 60s to counter the Russians. And we were still spending a lot of that money into the 80s as the Cold War came to an end. Thea, you said, I think we can all agree that debt is bad, but while
the current debt, what I'm saying is like where we are now.
And while I think that's true of the four of us, I'm not entirely sure that the average American understands why the debt is bad. And so, like, I think I was trying to put it into perspective of like personal finances, because I think pretty much everybody in the country on some level deals with personal finances. And so most people are probably aware, like, if you get a credit card and you start charging stuff, right? You have a minimum payment due every month that, like, if you don't pay that, that's when like there's collectors coming and, they'll take away your credit card and all that stuff. But as long as you pay that minimum amount, you're okay. Like you can just keep charging and just keep paying the minimum amount. So the average American with consumer debt on a credit card, if they have a $6,000 balance and they only pay the minimums every month, it will take them 25 years to pay that off. Okay. So that's that. And you end up paying a lot of money in interest on that original $6,000. Okay. So that in itself is kind of bad. But if you sit there and you go, well, whatever. Okay. It takes me 25 years to pay it off, but at least I'm buying my stuff and everything. Okay. But here's what's also happening. It's not just one credit card. We, the country, have maxed out one credit card, and then we went and took out another credit card. But because we're maxed out, we just saw, I think it was about a week or two ago, yet another credit bureau downgraded the U.S.'s credit rating for the rest of the world as being a slightly less safe and reliable investment. What basically that's like your personal credit score. And so now instead of being able to get, say, 8% on the new credit card, now the new credit card you get is 12% interest because they're like, you're a little bit more of a risk. So now you still got all that debt on the original 8% credit card. You just took out a 12% credit card and you start racking up more charges on that because you're just paying the bare minimum on the first one. And you still want to live the lavish lifestyle that you've gotten accustomed to. And then when that one's maxed out, you're like, oh crap, I need more credit. Let me take out another credit card. Well, guess what? Now that one's 25% because you're such a bad credit risk. And that's where we are as a country, where we are only paying the minimum. And because of inflation, our dollars are worth less tomorrow to pay the interest that we have accumulated on the debt, which means that we need to borrow more of those worth less dollars to pay the interest that keeps growing. And we're just in this spiral.
See, Dion, I tried to throw the right a bone here, but now you're bringing me back to throw another grenade. The only reason that those credit ratings were downgraded is because the right is saying, I don't feel like paying it off anymore. They're the ones saying, yeah, maybe I just won't pay that credit card bill anymore. So, I mean, yeah, everything else that you're saying, yeah, absolutely true. But I think the only other thing I'd push back on is that I think most American families that are carrying that kind of credit card debt, they're not like, whatever, I'm just going to pay the minimum. It'll take me 25 years to pay it off. I think they just can't pay more than that because of the economic situation that they're in. It's not that they're, like I don't feel like paying more. I've got more, but I don't want to pay more. They just can't pay more.
I think also going back to what you're saying, Dion, because I'll be honest, it was only in recent years where I think I even paid attention to understand what it meant, when people talked about the debt, the national debt, and where I even understood that we were paying interest on it, where I even understood that that debt was held by other countries, some of them, who are adversarial to us, including China. I don't think, and it's not that I guess it just wasn't ever, it's not how it's explained, right? And so the only time I really heard about the debt or deficit spending was when there were these battles and fights over bills every year in Congress. And I never really heard anyone talking about, like, what are the long-term effects of this? Where is all this, where are my tax dollars really going? That so much, of my tax dollars are going to pay off debt, money that we owe and interest that we owe. I didn't understand that, right? I didn't have, because again, it's just not something that's spoken of. And so I do think that when people have and I don't fault the average person for not knowing that, because as Will just alluded to, we all have our own finances to worry about and our own bills to pay. And, it's just like you expect that the people in government that you've elected, that's their job, is to help us be in a good financial position. And you kind of expect that that's what government's going to do. And I don't think the average person really is thinking about, well, man, are they really letting us down like that? And is this really where we are? And like I said, it really is only as I've gotten older, and I don't even know why. Maybe I've just kind of gone down the rabbit hole of podcasts. So plug for listening to this podcast, where I really started to kind of understand some of these issues. And unfortunately, but I do think when people know more, they have a different opinion. And I don't think that the average American would agree that that paying the amount of interest on our debt that we are paying right now is a good thing. I'll say, as someone who had credit card debt, when I got out of the military, I went to law school, and I was, for 3 years, I didn't really have a job. and I kind of, went from working full time to, trying to live off of a stipend and being a full-time student. And then, it took me, and then I was a clerk for a year after I graduated at the courts, which was a great opportunity, but didn't pay for crap. And so by the time I started, working at a law firm, I had run up significant debt, as far as credit card bills went. And like Will said, it wasn't, I wasn't not paying on it. It's just over time, I realized that I was here and there, my car needed new tires. So, I'll put it on a credit card, or these things would come up. And next thing I know, I had thousands of dollars in debt. And my life changed when I paid that off, right? Like suddenly it was like I was suddenly rich, because for a period of time I was spending, I guess all of my discretionary money trying to pay off credit card debt, and all the interest that was coming with it. And once it was paid off, now I had money to do things like save and, think about buying a house. And it just changed my life. And I think, well, where would we be as a country if we could spend our money to reinvest in ourselves and weren't spending so much money to pay on this debt and carrying this debt? You know what I mean? And so, I guess that's an analogy to personal finances. As someone who has struggled with personal debt, it's a terrible place to be. It really is. It stresses you out, and you can't do the things you want to do. And then even when you do want to borrow money, you have to borrow money at a higher rate because your credit isn't as high. And that's where we are as a country. We're sitting here with low credit score and holding on a lot of debt. And that's it. It's not a good place to be.
I think that, we're getting close to an hour here. So maybe we've talked a lot about what the debt is and how it's bad, but I wonder if we could maybe, like, if you were king for a day. I can't say if you were president for the day, because the president doesn't have the power of the purse, right? But if you were king for the day, like,
or queen
or emperor, empress, whatever, what would you do? Like, I mean, it's easy to say I would cut spending and I would, raise taxes, whatever, right? But, more specifically, are there things that you would do if you could snap your fingers and do something reasonable today that would set us on a better path for the future? I think I'll start with Brett.
Sure. So, I mean, gosh, there's a lot here. This is not a very black and white issue, but if you're trying to keep it simple, you have to look at the biggest chunk of where our money goes, right? Because that's one of the things that my wife and I do, is that we actually coach people in learning how to balance their budget. For our listeners, I probably haven't talked about this a whole lot, just so you kind of understand my background a bit. But my wife and I, we coach people in learning how to start a side hustle, right? Because there's a lot of people that want to do that, but the two biggest issues that we face is that they either say, I don't have time, or I don't have money. And we've shown people how, with their normal budget, how they can actually find money and restructure their budget to be able to do that. So I'm very familiar with how to go through and handle structuring a budget. So when looking at do that, you start looking at your biggest expenditures, right? And you categorize those. You look at how you can reduce those restructure money, all that kind of stuff. So the same thing would go to apply for the federal budget. Like, we have to look at our big spenders. So we have to look at Social Security. We have to look at Medicare. We have to look at our military spending. Those have to be lessened. And so the plan that you have to go into that, because again, this is why it's political suicide with these things, is because like, oh my gosh, you're going to touch my Social Security. Like, you're going to wreck my whole retirement program. Well, my first level of advice would be there, stop relying on the government for your retirement. You need better planning for that. You need more education around that. So that would be a piece of it, as well as go into our public school system, which we've shown has not been benefiting the American people for several generations now. But looking at that and actually teaching people an economics class and actually a personal finance class, but then responsibility that goes along with that. There's so much more that can be taught there, and also a civics class, right? So we can actually see and teach about the national debt and why it's bad and everything around that, so people have an understanding of it and the responsibility that comes with it. But you've got to go in to cut those. It wouldn't be an immediate axe, because I think it would be terrible to truly cut people off that have been planning on that and relying on it. But putting some type of age cap on the Social Security aspect of things, where it's like, okay, from this age on, like, whatever you've paid in, we'll do our best to keep that, but we're changing the program. We have to look better to take care of our children and grandchildren and future generations. Otherwise, it's going to be worse. So you have to make that change. And the same thing kind of goes with Medicare, Medicaid, is finding ways to start shuffling that off of the government's hand and putting it back into the people's hands and private sector, letting things handle that. Those are the big chunks that are there. And then once you kind of free up that money, if the taxes stay the same, now you have that ability to start paying down that debt. And then once that debt's gone, now you've got 14% of your budget that is back available to spending. And now we can start looking at advancing ourselves forward. So the government would have to go lean for a handful of years. I don't know if it'd be 5, 10, 20 years, maybe, but they would have to enter a time frame where they have to learn to live lean. Just like somebody in the personal finance would have to do the same thing. Guess what? You're going to have to not watch Netflix. You're going to have to not go to Chipotle. You can't have those extra things. But if you budget appropriately, maybe once a month, you can go out and do something, right? It's the same idea. You have to apply those principles coming into it.
I'm going next.
Go next, Will.
Take everything Brett just said, but instead of putting it on the backs of the poorest Americans, put it on the backs of the richest. I tend to agree that there is a time period that we would have to go lean, pay down the debt, stop paying so much in interest, so that we can eventually get that money back and actually start using it for ourselves rather than just paying off the interest. Some of the best economic years of the last 100 years or so were when we had, like, not that I'm arguing 90% is the way to go, but we had 90% as the top income tax rate through the 40s, 50s, 60s. I mean, it was 70% like up until the 80s. If we close the loopholes, if we tax the rich appropriately, we can use that surplus to start paying down the debt, stop paying as much in interest, and then eventually we can add programs, or we can start doing the things we really want to be doing with that money. But I don't think that we come in right off the bat and say, hey, all that money you put into Social Security, yeah, we're going to try our best to let you keep that, but we're all going to have to tighten our belts a little bit. I think the first people that should be tightening their belts are the people who are billionaires in our country. But I do think the first priority is getting to the point where we're not spending as much on interest.
Now, don't disagree with you, Will. However, you do realize that the lower 40% of the income bracket don't actually pay taxes. So when you're talking about the poorest Americans, they're not paying into the system anyway. They typically get a refund on that. Right. So there is a balance that's there. It's the middle class that typically suffers. So, yes, I think there are available avenues to put more money from the rich into the system. Although, when people always kind of throw out that pay that fair share thing, I'm like, I'm sorry, I pay more in taxes than some people earn in a year. So I have some issues with that.
I definitely pay more in taxes than most people earn in a year. I can say that for a fact.
But I'm also sensitive to the fact that Warren Buffett says that he pays less taxes than his secretary. There are. I know that. Yes, I was being very a little bit facetious with how I was answering my side of that question. But yeah, I think that there's a lot to be said for closing loopholes and having the rich pay their fair share.
Yeah, I can go next because I think we should give Dion the Libertarian the last word on this. But I think what I would do is I would like to see a in-depth study of the corporations that have benefited the most from different bailouts that we've done over the last 20 years, and the industries that have benefited the most. And I would look to tax how those industries are taxed, how those companies are taxed, and I would really look to recover a lot of money in changing whatever the tax structure is for those types of companies. And so I really would look for it on the corporate tax side. So instead of, because I do think that we've put a lot of money into certain industries, whether it be banking, even the automobile industry, and we haven't gotten the return on our investment that we were promised or that we were entitled to as the American people. So I would need to do studies. I'm as much as I make fun of Dion, I too am data driven. So I'd want to see what the dollars look like as far as how those companies profited from those bailouts and how much money, how much tax dollars went into it. Even if you look at the COVID vaccine, and basically, so you have pharmaceutical industry profiting now based on the investment on the American people, right? So I would look at all these different industries that have had this investment and then look at how much money they've made off of it. And I would look to tax that and try to recover some of that money on the corporate side across the board. And then I also agree with Will as far as looking at, can we recover, or I guess I'm not cutting taxes, but looking at whatever loopholes exist that allow the folks at the top 1% to maintain their wealth to the level that they can. And it seems like perhaps not paying as much in taxes as they could, as much as they could afford to. And then any benefits that they are receiving, as a result, again, of our current laws and structure, perhaps tax that. So we'll see. But I would need data.
And Thea, since our Supreme Court has decided that corporations are people, when I say tax the rich, I'm also including corporations in that 100%. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, Dion.
So speaking of data, I'm going to go to one of my favorite sources, which is taxfoundation.org. As far as I can tell, their data is about as nonpartisan as you can get. They cite their sources, and most of their sources are the IRS itself. So it's kind of hard to argue with that data. But the latest data they have is from 2024. Yeah. And the 97% of all taxes, 97.7% of all federal income taxes were paid by the top 50% of earners. So I'm not saying that to make a definitive argument that the rich are paying their share, but I do think that there maybe is this misperception out there that the rich aren't paying a lot. The top 1% actually pay 20% of the taxes, right? So they earn a lot of money, but they also pay a lot more than quote unquote their fair share of that pot of money into taxes. Now, here is something that we could look at. I'm not espousing this from a libertarian standpoint, but from more of a fairness of the law standpoint. So the first time I noticed this was after I had gotten out of active duty and I was earning money from a civilian job. And I reached a threshold in December of that year where all of a sudden my last paycheck was bigger than I was used to it being. And I couldn't figure out why. And when I looked at it, I realized that they had not taken any Social Security tax out of that paycheck. And I was like, why did this happen? Did they make a mistake? No, it's because the amount of Social Security tax that is withdrawn from an individual is capped at a dollar amount each year. And so I pay the same amount of Social Security tax that Elon Musk or Bill Gates pays, which is definitely like not even a drop in the bucket. We're talking about like a couple of molecules of water in their bucket is the amount of money that they pay into Social Security. So there's something that, again, I am not advocating for increasing taxes on anybody, but if we wanted to look at something that would truly be fair, like the Social Security tax is 6.2%. Just let it be 6.2% of whatever you make and not be capped at some arbitrary dollar amount, which is pitifully low because I'm not rich. I'm like, I make good money, but I'm not rich. So like I should be paying throughout the year, and so should Bill Gates. So that's one thing. But you know, I'm with Brett as far as like I look around, I work for a government contractor, which means that I'm surrounded by the government all the time. I was on active duty. My dad was active duty, and so I grew up on base. So I have been around the federal government essentially since I was born, and there is waste everywhere. And I don't just mean waste in the terms of like, hey, there's this random government employee who's like not doing his job, he's just skirting by or whatever, or people are like shoveling funds wherever. I'm talking about the kind of waste where I think there are a lot of things that the government gets itself involved in that it just doesn't need to be involved in or shouldn't be involved in. And those are the places where we need to take a good hard look and say, why is the government doing this? And should it be doing this? I also, again, this is going to be not very libertarian of me, but I really don't think that grandma who is living off of Social Security checks today should be just cut off of Social Security. I think that we should get rid of Social Security, but we should do it in a graduated method where we say, hey, look, like these people, their Social Security is untouched. These people, they're going to see a reduced benefit and so on and so forth as you go down in age. But also at the same time, we should look at the fact that Social Security is not really like invested in the market or invested in anything that actually makes money. And so we have this huge pot of money that we could be investing into the market, that we could be investing into other areas where it could actually earn its own interest and grow and help offset the burden that we have now placed on Social Security through declining birth rates and an aging population. So there are things that we can do that are that subtly move the needle, but when you combine them, they really start to change and really start to add up to a significant vector change for us.
And that's what I was talking about, Dion. Just a clarification on my point when I was talking about Social Security and Medicare and stuff like that, is that it's not just a cutoff, but that there's that gradual change to where, like I said, it's going to be over a 10, 20 year period of doing that. But we get to the point where we're back to the government should only do for the people what they cannot do for themselves. And in all honesty, retirement is one of those things that you should be doing for yourself, or at least your community should be supporting it, not the federal government.
So, Dion, I mean, George W. Bush tried to privatize Social Security, and in theory, earning interest and investing it would be great unless the year happens to be like 2008 when everything takes a nosedive and then now everyone's screwed because their retirement's in the tank. But totally with you on scrapping the Social Security tax cap, though. That was very liberal of you. You had mentioned something earlier, and this is in order to help us get to the wrap up. When I was introing people, right, and I said, hey, our token libertarian, and I was like, man, also coming from the right, and then later in the episode, you kind of made a comment on that. Do you think, because part of the point of this podcast is to kind of understand where the different political ideologies and perspectives come from, is it fair to say that libertarians are right-leaning? Or do you think that that's not an accurate statement?
I think libertarians are kind of in the center and tangential to the Democrats and the Republicans in that, like, they definitely, I think, would be viewed as fiscal conservatives. They're all about like, Austrian economics and everything, like, market driven forces, that kind of thing, which I think is usually more ascribed to the right than to the left. But libertarians are
Although we've
also
come to the conclusion that that's not true. We just
right.
describe it that way.
Yeah.
Okay.
But libertarians also were one of the very first, large political parties to call for the legalization of pot. Libertarians don't care about gay marriage. They don't care about, whatever. Basically, libertarians are like, look, whatever you and another consenting adult want to do is completely your business. Have at it. Right. Like, and then, where we might differ from the left in some areas is, I think a lot of libertarians take a look at children and go, okay, legally they're minors for a reason. So there should be added protections for minors from certain things. They probably find themselves a little bit closer to the Republicans on things like parental rights and that kind of thing. But also I shouldn't say most. The Libertarian Party is maybe split 50-50 on issues like abortion, where, some people are like, well, what about the liberties of the fetus? And the other people are like, what are about the liberties of the mother? That kind of thing. So, but yeah, in general, I think the Libertarian Party finds itself, depending on the specific topic, either right or left. But in general, I think I think the Libertarian Party can really be summed up as live and let live.
And then would you then say that equates to being centrist, or just that you can't be ascribed to the left or the right?
Probably a little bit of both. And I think honestly, like, the way that our politics is set up, it favors a two-party system. But I think if most people were very honest with themselves, they would probably find themselves leaning more libertarian than the other two parties, just in terms of like the core party beliefs and platform.
Okay. I appreciate that clarification. I know, and I don't think it's the first time that it's come up. But part of why we do this podcast is to kind of help everyone understand where each other's political differences come from and why we believe the things we do. So to wrap up this episode, Dion, why don't you start us off, and then to Thea next. What's making you happy?
What's been making me happy this week? So many things. I have a little prop that I can point to. So for those of you that are only listening and not viewing, what I'm holding here is an incomplete space shuttle model. It's one of those metal Earth models that you have to bend metal and put together. So I'm in the process of making this. I'm taking my time so that it doesn't look like utter garbage when I'm done with it. But it's great. I have this one that I'm working on, and then I also got myself some of my favorites, the James Webb Space Telescope and the Lockheed SR-71, which are just amazing technological things. I guess one of the other things
that's, and the listeners who have never heard of it, what is Metal Earth?
Oh, okay. So as you can see, it comes in this very, very flat package. And I'll show you, here's one of the sheets that I've clipped the different pieces out. So it is, I think it's like 5 mils stainless steel. And it's got like all the parts have these little tabs and loops and things. And so, you kind of put it together like one of those old plastic models that we used to do as kids, but it's stainless steel instead. And so you have to actually like bend a lot of the parts and form them. So it's a lot of like, if you enjoy working with your hands and you enjoy doing little detailed things, it's a lot of fun.
Okay, so I actually am changing. I'm calling an audible and what's making me happy, and I'm not making this up. So as we're taping, I have a big family. I guess let me start with, I have a really big family. I have like over 100 cousins, and like second cousins, probably more than that. And it's just like nature of having like a huge immigrant family. And so a group of my cousins, I think there's 8-9 of us on a group text. And like a couple months ago, I had sent one of our episodes, and I was like, hey guys, listen to my podcast, because, I was trying to like see if I could get more people to listen. As we are taping this episode, I get a text from one of my cousins. So shout out to Chris. He says, I'm super late to the party, but Thea, I just wanted to say your podcast is really great. And I've listened to about 3 episodes so far these past few weeks, and it's really interesting topics. Nice work. Just like made my day. And I responded while we're taping. I was like, oh my God, we're actually taping an episode right now. And he's like, and you're responding to my text? And I'm like, yes. So I guess that's making me happy. And I've gotten feedback from another friend of mine also, that she listened and she thought it was interesting. So I really would like feedback from our listeners, because we're just regular people, so we will hear you and like incorporate whatever you say, because it's kind of like some of this I feel like is therapeutic for me doing this. Just it gives me the opportunity to talk about these topics. And I always tell people, it keeps me out of my bubble, because, I live and work in a space where a lot of people are very like-minded. And because I spent a huge part of my life in the opposite position when I was in the military, I realized, when you do live in your own bubble, it's easy to have blind spots as to what's going on and how people are seeing the world around you. And I find that doing this podcast helps me to stay a little bit more grounded, or to at least have a conversation that doesn't allow me to just hear my own echo chamber. And so it's making me happy to know, or at least hopefully that's we're providing that, same effect for the people that are listening, and they can be part of the leadership family. So that's what's making me happy.
Thanks, Thea. Brett?
That was really cool, Thea. I love the feedback. That's great.
Yeah. Yeah.
So for me, what's making me happy is I get the opportunity to take my son to a summer camp tomorrow. This is his 2nd year going. And last year we had a great time on the drive down. It's about a 6.5 hour drive from here. It's down in North Carolina. And so super excited about just getting in the car with him and getting to hang out with him and having conversations. And it's again, only our 2nd year doing it, but I'm looking forward to this trip every year, because as he grows, and then we get just a 6-hour time to talk and communicate and listen to audiobooks and hang out. And so I'm just really looking forward to that for the trip. And then we're going to go down and pick him up later in the week, and we're going to do family vacation after that. So looking to be a pretty good week.
I've got to take my daughter to camp starting tomorrow, and I'm not looking forward to it. So I've spent the last couple of days actually up in DC for the Unite for Veterans rally that's been going on up there. So that's kind of what's been making me happy. And I will say so the Unite for Veterans rally, there is some partisanship to it, primarily just because it's happening when Trump is in the White House, but there are some, the cuts to the VA, like the day before we went was when the Harvey Milk, renaming the naval vessel, when that news broke. So there was some level of partisanship to it, but largely it was, just everyone was there, in support of veterans and service members. And it was kind of cool to be around that group. It coincided, the very next day was the LGBTQ parade through Washington, D.C. So it was, Vietnam hippies and Speedo clad people with like water wings, like walking down the street. It was such an eclectic group, but it was cool to be there. And I hadn't been to DC since I was stationed there a while ago. So it was just kind of good to be back and that sort of thing. So that's what's making me happy. Yeah, as Thea mentioned, we love the feedback, and the reason I was kind of asking Dion, tell us a little bit more about where you see libertarians falling. There are times when I think each of us in the bubbles that we live in and I'll speak just for myself. I find myself getting pretty upset at folks on the other side of the aisle. But it's these kinds of conversations, with the three of you, and just knowing that, we can have civil discussions and, trying to understand where everyone comes from. And that helps to bust me out of my bubble and make sure that I'm keeping things kind of straight in my head. I think that's going to help as we move into our topic for next week, which we are anticipating it being a discussion of what's going on in predominantly LA right now with the call up of the National Guard, potentially the use of Marines was just mentioned today. But the use of the military on domestic soil, and that'll give us a little bit of time. And I should mention it won't be next week because that's Father's Day. So it'll be the week after that, 2 weeks from now when we come back. So we'll be able to provide our perspectives coming from the military. So if you're enjoying these conversations, please hit like and subscribe. Give us some comments on what you're hearing so that we can incorporate that into the show itself. And we will be back with you again 2 weeks from now. Have a good week, everyone.